Shalom, everyone. I'm glad you came on a Wednesday night. Down here, it was the terrible temperature today. It was only 70, but I suffered through it. But, that's the way it goes. Cheyenne, you brought a visitor. Very interesting. Well, anyway, okay, so let's get started. We're on the lesson that's called Vayike. Vayike. Now, Vayike, if you go to the Bible, why don't we just go there and that'll be my starting point. So I want you to go to the chapter 47, and I want you to look at verse 28. Okay? That's where we're going to start. Now, if you have an art scroll, that's great because I want you to look also at the Hebrew side. Not that you're going to have to read anything over there, but I want you to look at it. And the reason I want you to look at it is because this Torah portion we're about to study is different than any of the others in the book of Genesis. And by that, I mean to say that it is a Parsha Setuma, meaning it's a closed portion. If you look at the text on the right side, you'll see that the line that we just finished will go to the very end. And the very beginning starts right there at the first side on the right. In other words, there's usually, if you look at other Parsha sections, you will see that there's a paragraph space, something to let you know you've ended one and begun the other. This one doesn't have it because the events that are occurring prior are also important now. And by that, I want to give you something that my wife had asked me about, and I want to kind of go about it in, kind of a similar way. If you look at chapter 47 and you look at verse 28, you have the word Vayike. Well, Jacob's name isn't Vayike, but what it's saying is, and lived in the land, and lived. Now, it's understood that they're talking about Jacob, and that's why the English side presents Jacob. So, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. And the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. Now, the time approached for Israel to die. So he called his sons together for Joseph, and he said unto him, please, if I have favor in your eyes, please place your hand under my thigh. Now, the concepts that are going on here are very simple ones. Remember when we studied Sarah's life? Do you remember how it began? This is Sarah's life. Here we're talking about Jacob lived. In other words, we're understanding that there was a real death here. In fact, Rashi says that this is one of the reasons why this is a closed portion, is because what happened before and this tie together. Now, in order to tie together, you have to really go back to the beginning of chapter 47, and I want you to look at verse number, let's start in verse number 7, 47:7, okay? It says, then Joseph brought Jacob, his father, and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Now, the fact that Jacob could bless him, remember, he's a king. Kings bless you, you don't bless them. The only understandable reason why he could do that was the fact of his elderly age. In other words, he was one that they looked at upon as one who has reached the end of his life. And so therefore he could pass a blessing on to someone else. Now the Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many are the days of your years of your life? So Pharaoh is now into the conversation, and he's looking at him. He probably sees a very ruddy complexion, because remember, Jacob is a shepherd. And so he spent a lot of time, 14 years, 20 years actually, with Laban, where his work was always outside. So by the time he reaches this point, we find ourselves looking at this character, and we're saying to ourselves, my, how old are you? That's what he's asking. But notice what it says next. The days of my sojourns, and notice that, my sojourns. So his life has been one move after another. Have been 130 years. Few and bad have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not reached the lifespans of my forefathers in the days of their sojourns. When Jacob recollects where all that's happened to him so far, all the blessings that have happened to him, none of them appear in his story. Only things that we hear about here are his sorrows, his disappointments, and the things that went wrong. And it was for 130 years. And so the question then became, why, what's going on here? What happened? Why is, that's the questions that rabbis will ask. And it's the question we should ask. You've read about Jacob's life all the way through. Couldn't you find something good to talk about? But yet he couldn't find anything. Now, there's a point in this whole story, and the point is, where else can I find the number 130? For that, I have to go all the way back to the book of Genesis. You see, after Adam and Eve were dismissed from the garden, after the death of Abel, Adam could no longer take it, and he separated himself from his wife. In fact, he tried to find his way back into paradise without her. Now, Adam couldn't get back into paradise because he still had things that he hadn't rectified, things that he never will rectify in his life. And his life was 930 years. So how are these two tied together? That's where it comes. And again, I go to Rashi. Rashi is the simplest one, not the only one. In fact, Rashi is almost mystical by the way he speaks in this point. And he begins by talking about the fact that in our story, we're looking at a case of something happening, something that is totally bizarre. You see, Adam had transgressed against God. He had sinned. Now, he also, in that sin, actually committed 3 sins, not 1. And those 3 sins, if you ever go to the book of Amos, you'll find out that God can forgive sins, but there's some sins that he doesn't want to forgive. They have to work through it. That's where we're at this particular point in time. Now, the first thing that he did was the fact that he transgressed God's commandment. And when he did that, he denied God. He denied what God had told him to do. Now, that wasn't the only thing. Next, he brought death into the world, which showed up in his first son killing his second. And he knew that. Then came a third event, a little bit different. You see, when Adam couldn't get back into the paradise that he had left or had lost, he sat down in the river at the edge of paradise, and he spent the next 130 years sitting in that water. Now, according to mystical writings and according to others in the midrashes, while he was there, he found himself involved in other things, maybe not willingly, but he found himself set apart. Now, the only way Adam could be taken care of, because he couldn't do it in his own lifetime, was through help. And so he got the help of the fathers. Now, Adam was the father of all people. But the fathers that he got help from were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The fathers, the patriarchs, the heads of the clan of the Jews. Now, Abraham wasn't a Jew at that point in time. Abraham was a Gentile, just like me. But he became a Jew as the Jews understand it. Abraham had something special about him. We know he had the gift of Hesed, the gift of kindness, the way he worked with other people, the way he talked to other people, the way he changed other people. You see, he was the only one on his side of the river who actually believed that there was only one God. Now, the reason he had to deal so hard is because of what Adam did. Remember Eve? Remember the snake story? What did the snake offer Eve? To know what God knows. Now, if you know exactly what God knows, who's God? And that's what he's offering. So Abraham was the contrast to that. He was the one who believed that there was only one God. Now, in our story then, we need to add two more details. Every human soul, I don't know if you understand or know, there are 5 parts to each person's soul. There's the nephesh, or our animal soul. There's the second part, which is the ruach, the breath of us. The third is the neshama. This is where we begin to see the actual life of a man who is committed to God. You see, those are the 3 that you and I all have, we possess. Because you see, we all believe in the one true God. We have chosen to follow that. Now there's 4 and 5. 4 is hayah, that's life. And yechidah, which is togetherness with God. In other words, that part of my soul is completely within him. It's attached to him. Well, Adam needed to rectify 3 parts to his soul. He needed to rectify his nephesh, but he couldn't. So the person who took care of the need for God was Abraham. You see, that's what he provided. Now, the second part of the soul was left to his son, Isaac. You see, by what he had done, he had brought murder into the world. And in essence, he had left murder on the table. It was Isaac who took murder off the table. Because you see, Isaac offered his own life. Now, the third part of his soul was the part of the soul that Jacob was dealing with. You see, he was having to deal with all kinds of, well, for lack of a better term, evil, adultery. He had to deal with those things that came between God and Adam. And it took him 130 years. Now, in reality, we know, first off, Laban, living with Laban for 20 years, he dealt with a lot of things that we shouldn't have to. And Esau wanted to kill him. And besides that, he found himself in a situation where, well, for lack of a better term, Rachel, his favorite wife, was taken from him early. The next thing that happened to him was his daughter, Dinah, his only daughter, according to our stories, was raped. Now, beyond that, we have these other stories to deal with. The fact that Joseph, his favorite son, was dead to him for 20-some years. And he had to go through life thinking that his favorite son was gone. And then finally, of all things that have to happen to him, he had trouble, remember, with Simeon. You see, Simeon was captured. Well, technically, Joseph held him in captivity. Before this whole thing gets done, Jacob has become a very tired man. But you could understand why. Because you see, when he was looking at his life, all he could see was the negativity. And what was worse was when Joseph was taken, he lost his ability to perceive. He lost the Ruach HaKodesh. He lost the Holy Spirit. And so therefore he was not, for those years that Joseph is gone, he does not have the ability to prophesy. And so his mind was no different than mine, except he was carrying a lot more baggage than I do. Now, as we go through this story, Jacob is going to receive a life force influx when he comes down to Egypt. But you understand, he has to come down to Egypt. Up until now, he's been bartering, wanting others to take care of it, because he was not interested in going into captivity, because he knew that's what was coming. Remember the prophecies given to his grandfather, Abraham. Now, in the cutting of the pieces, 400 years were prophesied on his family. And they would spend time in Egypt. And Jacob didn't want to go. Over and over again, we find a man who, well, he's lost his vision. He's lost his understanding. And that vision comes from what 17 tells us. You see, we're going to take two numbers and we're going to put them together. We're going to take 130, and 130 is a Hebrew letter called Ein. Ein. And the 17 form the word Tov. Ein Tov, the good eye. You see, in this period of time, he had lost the good eye. He saw everything through a glass half empty. Something was missing. Something wasn't there. Backing out of that story for a second, I want to tell you about a character called Viktor Frankl. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Viktor Frankl was a psychologist, psychiatrist. He was a tremendous teacher. He was living in Austria in 1930s. He had a going practice of working with women who had been raped. And so he was developing a philosophy or a theory on how to deal with that whole set of circumstances. While in the midst of that, Adolf Hitler annexed Austria. And Viktor Frankl is a Jew. Now, they didn't take him to a Nazi concentration camp right away. They just simply eliminated his job. He could no longer work. And so he found himself in the ghetto in Vienna. Well, as time went on and the final solution was into force, he and his whole family were taken to a prison just outside of Vienna. And that's where they stayed for close to 6 months. And then they were moved. Not to a nice resort, Bergenau, a camp in which incineration was quite common. Well, he was separated from his mother, and he was separated from his father, and he was separated from his wife. In fact, all of them died in the concentration camp. He was shipped off to Auschwitz. And he was there in Auschwitz for a period of time, up until the time that the army actually opened up the camp and freed him. But one of the things that I found, and I've always kept it, it's in a book that he wrote, it's called Man's Searching for Meaning. And I want to read you what he wrote. We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting us, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been a few in number, but they offered sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances and to choose one's own way. Decisions, not conditions, determine what a man is. The one thing you can't take away from me is the way I choose to respond to what you do to me. Powerful thoughts. I try to remember them because they're burned in my brain. But you see, I still have this problem of seeing out of the good eye. We all do. But that concept of seeing out of the good eye is very important. In fact, in the Talmud, Rabbi Eliezer, actually it's in the Ethics of the Fathers, talks about this very same thing. He talks about the fact that we have the opportunity to see the world differently. We can see it for what it's good for. It's always easier to see what is glaringly wrong, but it's the subtle right that we really should be looking for. So in our story then, one must choose between the lens of right, the lens of good, or the lens of tov. You see, the right eye is the eye of hesed. It's the eye of kindness. The left eye is the eye of gevurah. It's the idea of judgment. How often do we judge people? How often do we judge things? And that's the story that he's dealing with. And it's not till he reaches down into Egypt itself that all of a sudden life changes. And now he has the Ruach HaKodesh, and now he has the ability to see with his right eye. And so for 17 years, it is good. It is good. It's important the older we get, and Cheyenne, you don't qualify yet, but for the older we get, we have the opportunity to spend more time looking for the right, looking for the good that's there. Now, it is written, the left eye is the Ein Hara, the eye of evil. Now, the idea is the fact that, well, let me take you to one of the corollaries to the commandments. And the corollary is a Jew is told not to gaze at a fellow's field of standing grain, lest we damage it with our evil eye. What he's talking about is the commandment of coveting. When one finds themselves looking at somebody else's field with envy, what they have that we don't have, where they've accomplished and we haven't done anything, that's not our right. Therefore, it is important that we only use our right eye. Now, not literally, but metaphorically. It's what it's going to teach us. Now, the second rabbi, Lubavitcher rabbi, Dover Schnur, he talked about this idea of the eye. The evil eye refers not to physical sight, but it refers to spiritual vision. And what triggers that spiritual vision is our intellect. I was a teacher for 13 years, and I was a principal for the rest. So over time, I got to watch a few teachers teach. The good, some bad. And the whole process of my teaching and learning and watching and seeing what was going on. There was a story that came to me that I talked with my staff about. In fact, I was constantly talking with my staff about where my kids were at. And you notice I still use the word my kids. You see, every kid that ever passed through my school, I knew them by name. And I believed that they were all important. In fact, I kept telling them all, hey, listen, you've got to graduate from high school. You've got to get a job. You're going to support me. And if you don't get a job, then I don't know what's going to happen to me. And so I impressed upon them the idea of a work ethic. But then I talked with my teachers about a study that had been done at Purdue University. Purdue's not far away from where I lived, but it was a very important study. You see, one of the things that happened was that they took the teachers in the schools in Lafayette, and they gave them sheets of paper that told them how smart each of the kids were in their class. Now, if you know how smart the kids are in the class, chances are you're going to teach differently, because you're going to teach the ones that you know are smart different than the ones you know aren't going to learn as fast. Or maybe they're troubled kids, and maybe that's why they're not going to learn at all. Well, sure enough, when the study was done after a 7-year period, those students who had been identified as being high achieving all had scores higher than what they should have. Because you see, every teacher took time to make sure they got every lesson and they understood every concept. Now, the ones that were not identified as high achieving, but actually low achieving, they all were also successful. They all scored below what they were capable of. And so I talked with my teachers about the fact that we can't do that. We have to understand that everybody can learn. What I didn't realize is we need to teach with our right eye. We need to teach with the good eye. Well, that kind of leads me to something else. I want you to, let's see, how am I going to put this? When Rabbi Eliezer started talking about words of wisdom, ideas that had to come down through the ages, because you see, Rabbi Eliezer didn't appear on the scene until the 2nd century. And all that wisdom that had happened up until then and before it, all that wisdom, he began to look at it and he said, we need to put it into a form. And so he did. He created what we call the Pirkei Avot, the understanding of the fathers. And as he did that, he began to look at something else. I want you to go back to the book of Vayiki, and I want you to look at the story of Jacob blessing his grandsons. Now, we know when he finishes blessing his grandsons won't be grandsons anymore. They'll be actually adopted sons. That instead of 12 tribes, there will be 13 now, by the time it is all over. But Jacob does a very strange thing in this process. And if you go to the story, you look over at chapter 48. It begins by saying, and it came to pass that after these things, that someone said to Joseph, behold, your father is ill. So he took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. And Jacob was told, behold, your son Joseph has come to you. So Israel exerted himself and sat up on his bed. In other words, he was in the process of dying. And he was in his bed, and somebody had to come and tell him that his son was there. Well, it goes on to say, and Jacob said to Joseph, El Shaddai had appeared to me in Luz, in the land of Canaan, and he blessed me. Well, Luz was the place of the ladder. Bethel is another name that was used there, but Luz was the place. And he said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a congregation of nations, and I will give to you your land offspring after you, and as eternal possession. And now to your sons, your 2 sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before my coming to you in Egypt, shall be mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, like Reuben and Simeon. But progeny born to you after them shall be yours. Now, we don't know if Joseph ever had any other children besides these 2, but these 2 are now going to be adopted by the father. And they will be included under the name of their brothers with regard to their inheritance. But as for you, when I came from Padan, Rachel died on me in the land of Canaan on the road, while there was still a stretch of land to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there alongside the road of Ephrath, which is at Bethel. Now then Israel saw Joseph's sons, and he said to him, who are these? So Joseph has to tell him who his sons are. But as he's going through that process of telling him, now Israel's eyes were very heavy of age, so he can't really see what's going on. But he could because he could not see. So he brought them near to him and he kissed them and he hugged them. Touch. Touch is so important for children. One of the things that I was most disgusted with is the fact that teachers were not allowed to touch kids. And a principal was especially not supposed to touch kids. I probably should have gotten fired, but I loved kids. And so I let them hug me if they wanted to, but I gave every kid a high five. Drove the teachers nuts because they were so excited to give me a high five and beat my hand to death. But anyway, that's beside the story. Israel said to Joseph, I dared not accept the thought that I would see your face. And he talks about himself. So Joseph then removed them from his knees and he prostrated himself with his face towards the ground. And Joseph took two of them. Now here's Jacob on the ground, raising hands, and he's going to bless them. Ephraim with his right hand to Israel left, and Manasseh was on his left to Israel's right. Okay, back to my story. Right and left. Right side is kindness, wholesome. Left side is judgment and might. Notice what happens. And he drew close to him, but Israel extended his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head. Cross. So he was younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head. He maneuvered his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph, and he said, O God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, God who shepherds me for my inception until this day, may the angel who deems me from all evil bless these lads. And so he blessed the lads opposite. Opposite. Now, what's the significance? Well, the left hand should have gone to the older son. In other words, that should have been his. And it wasn't. Well, it was by crossing his hands. Ephraim's kingdom, the 10 kings, 10 states, the 10 tribes, will follow Ephraim. Manasseh, his rule, will actually be done in Egypt because you see, he replaces his father. All along, every time Jacob's sons came down, they met with Joseph, but sitting right next to him as his clerk was Manasseh. Ephraim was never in the tent. You see, Ephraim wanted to learn Torah. That was his goal. And that is a goal that God would eventually honor. Something had changed. Now, one of the things that happens with this is the idea of the blessing. Well, let me go from it this way. I'm retired. One of the greatest things about being retired, and my wife will attest to this because she does it constantly, you're the last to get up in the morning. In other words, you have no responsibilities. You're clean. So being retired, one of the things that you do, and I'm sure that Mike and Rod and probably the rest of you do it, is recite the prayer called Mode'ani. Mode'ani is the morning prayer. That's the prayer in which you, when you wake up in the morning, you say, I thank you, living and enduring King, for you have graciously returned my soul within me. Great is your faithfulness. That's the morning prayers. There were many days when I got out of bed 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning and ended up at school as soon as I could get my clothes on. I didn't take time to do that. And those days were the days that I looked with my left eye. Those were the days that I found myself in more trouble than I could ever possibly hope for, no matter what I did. Ani modeh, we say, means I thank you. But actually, literally it says, thank you, I. It's not about thanking me. It's about making sure I thank God. Moving to the right eye. Moving to the blessings. Our story today is about blessings. That's what morning was supposed to be about. And if you miss mornings, you always have the afternoons, I hope. But the concept is everything is good. I got one more thought for you, and this is a Hebrew thought. I found that I'm becoming to appreciate the Hebrew grammar more than ever before. And the reason I'm finding it true is because I'm understanding what we think it means is not necessarily how it means. Now, there was a word that I learned, it's called avar. Simple word, means for the past. But there's another word that's almost the same, one letter difference, and it's called avera. And avera means sin. Now, I was thinking about this. Living in the past, relying on the past, focusing on the past, whether good or not, is unhealthy. Our focus needs to be on the present, on today, on this moment. So begin, this is for you. I'm talking to myself. So begin the day with the admission that no matter what we have been up to until now, today is a new opportunity. Today is a day to test your right eye. Now, there's more to the story. Modeh can also mean surrender. The recognition of surrendering to God from the very beginning. Modeh also means to admit that God is in charge. All comes from a simple blessing that begins the morning that Joseph understood, not in the way he hoped he would, because eventually he is also going to die in our chapter. And the nation will be without its two great leaders, and new leaders will need to step up. Now, they don't need to step up right away because Israel is going to spend 210 years in captivity, as we call it. Only 83 of those years was actually painful. The last 83. Getting worse and worse. Because what took the throne was a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. Next week, we start Shemot. Hopefully, we'll have something new, something I can share with you that'll be something you hadn't heard before. But I've talked 45 minutes, so it's, I guess, back to you folks. Anybody have a question, a thought? Remember, when we study, the hope is you meditate on this. Rabbi Ginsburg, who I consider one of the great rabbis, every time he taught a lesson, he says, let's meditate on. Let's meditate on. Let's focus on that.